wish everybody a happy birthday. Published, I did some interviews with The Guardian, with The Times, bashing our head against a brick wall. No one was listening. After one of my exams, I was unable to write. If you was in a job, I'd be signing you off for at least 2 weeks. I spoke to some of the universities and I said, well, basically my arm hurts and I'm unable to write. And they went, okay, so what? Because I knew something was wrong. Really not spoken about.
70 hours a week as JCR president and working 20-hour days. Is that true?
Yeah, the number one goal of a DJ is actually to choose music people want to hear. I have a 600 song sort of list now. I'm sort of headlining, but I've interviewed James Gorman, who's the CEO of Morgan Stanley. I've got AJ Tracy to come to the Oxford Union. There's all these other people who I've had the opportunity to interact with. I have Big Nasty's manager's number. Normal to me now. If you have Dick and Dom on WhatsApp, I'm not blameless. I send the messages as well. Every time there's an election, yeah, I think it's a very good question and one I ask myself. There may still be the occasional bit of political gossip. I'm going to say we've covered a lot. I've done a lot of things. Past still exists. The way I construct sentences, not the way I speak. I have quite neutral accents. Sorry, I don't know that's quite my thing really. Fulfilled because that was the name of the slate that won the election against me. I don't know fully why it ended up happening.
Boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, Happy New Year and welcome back to my podcast, Coffee's on Me, David Quan, where I strive to give guests legacy-worthy interviews that listeners can enjoy while cooking, commuting, relaxing, or walking their pets. I hope the festive and holiday seasons have been relaxing and that we can all look forward to 2023 with a lot of excitement. We are approaching 5,000 podcast downloads, and if you have been enjoying the discussions on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts, please do consider leaving a review and nominating a guest by contacting me via my Linktree, David Quan. A highlight has actually been seeing this podcast on people's recent Spotify Wraps for 2022. I cannot thank all the guests enough for their courage and insights. Fitting for the first podcast episode of the year, my guest today is Oxford University's #1 BNOC, big name on campus. Daniel Dipper is a third-year history and politics student at Magdalene College, University of Oxford, and has just finished serving as Magdalen College's JCR president, as well as vice president of the Oxford Union. Daniel serves on the Sutton Trust Alumni Leadership Board, is a trustee for Potential Plus UK, Zero Gravity founding ambassador, and Imposter Syndrome Project lead for Youni. He is non-selective state school educated, the first in his immediate family to go to university, has a disability, and came runner-up for the Sutton Trust Social Mobility Award in 2020. In his spare time, Daniel is a writer on topics including music and social mobility, as well as being a DJ and performing at some of Oxford's largest student events. Daniel, Happy New Year. I'm very excited to party with you and welcome to my podcast, Coffee's on Me, David Quan.
Well, thank you so much for the invite, David.
Well, I think my most pressing problem or question for you is, will you wish me a happy birthday?
Well, I mean, if you're on my Facebook, I wish all my Facebook friends a happy birthday. I a lot of time every day, although mostly in the last few months I've got busy, so some of them were behind. But yeah, I've been doing it for over a year now, and it seems to bring much joy to people. So yes, if you're a Facebook friend, then yes.
So I've never met you properly in person, but I've heard so much about you. And one of the many things that people mention about you is that you take the time to wish everybody a happy birthday, as you said on Facebook. Did it only start in the past year, or and also why do you do that?
Yeah, so I started doing it in September 2022. Ultimately, it's almost in a weird way a lot of work to sort of in a weird way resolve a problem of being lazy, which was initially I was just not wishing anybody happy birthday. I was really flaky at doing it, and close friends, strangely enough, were getting a little bit annoyed because I hadn't wished them a happy birthday. But ultimately, because I was involved in a lot of things, I worked with a lot of people. I also wanted to make sure everyone was respected. So I was like, what's the easiest way of not annoying anybody whatsoever? Just wish everybody a happy birthday, and then that way everyone's treated with equality and respect. So it sort of started there, and yeah, I've been doing it now for about 16, 17 months, and sometimes I have to allocate 5 or 10 minutes a day to doing it. But I mean, some people literally said to me it's the only time that anyone actually wishes them a happy birthday on Facebook, or people reaching out to them and stuff. So obviously it does bring people joy, which is why I've kept doing it.
Well, going above and beyond for everyone seems to be a theme of your journey so far, and I'm really, really excited to touch on, core themes like social mobility, your role in the A-level kind of algorithms campaign, your kind of volunteering work for the Sutton Trust, the DJing, Oxford Unit, etc., etc., etc. But why don't we start at the A-level algorithms campaign?
Yep.
I know that your school, obviously, I read some articles where and even the Parliament's kind of report of your evidence. There you mentioned about kind of the disparity between schools from different socioeconomic backgrounds. So if we go back to 2020, what were you feeling when the first kind of algorithm came out and you thought about the implications it could have on you and your community?
Yes, I mean, ultimately, schools closed in March 2020, and the government within a few weeks sort of announced that they were going to have an algorithm. We weren't really sort of sure of the impact of it, but when you started to think about logically what the algorithm seems to be suggesting, there were sort of red flags. Also, it was talking about past performance, and also I'd outachieved my school's past performance in the past, and therefore I was particularly concerned on the impact it would have on people like myself and others from disadvantaged backgrounds. And also, one of the core assumptions of the model was where you come from impacts your ability, your projected ability, and ultimately that is, in my opinion, an anti-meritocratic way of looking at performance and ultimately holds individuals back. So that was when I really started to get concerned about it. And then I think it was around May or June, there was sort of a campaign group that was formed, that a few people that I knew was involved with. I sort of joined in it, and then I wrote a particular blog for Potential Plus UK, the charity as a trustee of, who were very supportive in allowing me to have a platform to raise these concerns, where basically as I outlined these concerns sort of a much more long form way, really stressing why I thought it could hold back individuals who were being socially mobile, moving maybe above where their school had done previously.
So I was in Australia at the time because I went through my schooling there, but I realized how much of an uproar this kind of system brought to with all the things that you've mentioned. So my curiosity is, out of all the thousands of students around the country, how were you able to gain the traction that you got? And keep in mind, at the time, you weren't a BNOC at Oxford, you didn't have the Oxford Union platform, etc.
Yes, I mean, basically, it was partly because I've been a beneficiary of so many social mobility programs. It meant I was quite proactive in reaching out, not just to the universities I'd applied to, but also reaching out to the Sutton Trust, and they allowed me to write a piece on their APPG on social mobility, where I was able to sort of touch a little bit on some of these issues. As I say, I was involved with this charity, Potential Plus UK, and they gave me a platform to sort of write my thoughts down. And ultimately, it was through this campaign group, just sort of stumbling upon it by chance, really, that opportunities to speak to the media and share my story were offered. So while they weren't published, I did some interviews with The Guardian, with The Times, where I raised my concerns. And they were quite supportive in that regard. And actually, the plan was basically, if I wasn't accepted into the universities I'd applied to, they were actually going to publish sort of a piece on my journey, my background, and why ultimately they felt that the algorithm had been so unjust. And the Channel 4 opportunity was ultimately to say someone from the campaign group meant to do it. They weren't able to do it. So they reached out to me and asked if I'd be happy to jump on it, which I did. So I was able to speak on sort of the opening bulletin of Channel 4 News just a few days before the results came out in England, just after the Scottish uproar. And that was how I sort of got that platform. And again, the charity that I was trustee of continued to support me and did another piece on it there.
What were your top two takeaways, either about politics, either about yourselves, either about society in general or the education system, from that kind of campaigning process? Top two.
So yeah, top two. So I think the first takeaway is that actually for a long time, as you sort of said, it felt like we were sort of bashing our head against a brick wall. No one was listening. So there was one or two pieces that were published before the Scottish results came out, but basically until the Education Select Committee, I believe around mid to end July, raised concerns about the algorithm, basically nobody would listen whatsoever, because ultimately it was talking about hypotheticals because they didn't really know what to expect. And I think as well, journalism is one of those professions where there are very few individuals from backgrounds similar to my own actually working in that industry. So I think also there was sort of a lived experience gap. Where ultimately they hadn't had that experience. They would just be, logically on the macro level, the algorithm mostly looked sensible. it was on the micro level where there were the issues. And also, if you've not had those micro experiences, then you're going to just engage with the macro and just think, yeah, that's sensible. So I think the first thing is sort of hypotheticals don't really work. You sort of have to have other events to build traction, really, because we only got traction after the Scotland results came out. I think the other sort of takeaway is ultimately when speaking to the media, you've got to consider what ultimately is their narrative, what ultimately is going to be able to reach a mass audience. Because of course, we were talking about a lot of detailed things to do with social mobility and the individual experience, but actually what really connected with individuals was telling a story first of all, but also as well feeding into a wider narrative of, in that case, basically the government doesn't know what they're doing with COVID. So obviously whenever sort of planning campaigns or speaking to the media, it's always thinking about ultimately not just what are you going to say. I mean, I felt very fairly represented by the journalists I spoke to, but ultimately how are they going to be able to sell that to a mass market?
Very fascinating. I mean, in terms of the story and in terms of like patience and resilience, it's obviously something you're personally very kind of familiar with, given kind of your, I was reading an article about the kind of long journey that you had to being diagnosed with the disability that you have. I think it's fibromyalgia, is that how I say it?
Yeah, fibromyalgia.
Wonderful. So what was really interesting, obviously, with that is initially the doctors thought it was just a strain from revision, and it took so long until you pressed the GP to kind of get a diagnosis. And when you got that diagnosis, that's when things really, at least you got some sense of clarity. So could you walk me through that initial process, because it must have, it was life-changing to say the least.
Yes, I mean, ultimately, basically what happened was during my GCSEs, after one of my exams, I was unable to write. So basically, I finished the exam and my arm was in a lot of pain. I was able to use a laptop for the exam in the afternoon because I had 2 exams in that particular day. And I was told I had to get an emergency note from a GP. So I went to see a GP, out of hours GP, on the evening after having done those 2 exams. And they basically said, if you was in a job, I'd be signing you off for at least 2 weeks, if not a month right now, having sort of looked at what you described and what you've sort of told me. But we know that's not realistic, so I'll just give you the 2-week doctor's note, and the exam board can use that as they need, and we're happy to provide anything else they sort of need. So that was it initially, and basically their advice at the time was, we know really you should be resting is our official advice. We know you can't do that, so basically our advice is just get through the exams and then have as much time off as you physically can over the summer, which I tried to do. And then I got back in September to school, and things were still not right. I was still in pain. My school at that point, it had taken a little bit of negotiation, but they were able to do like a handwriting test that basically showed that my handwriting was illegible. So I was able to change my usual way of working to a laptop, and they basically said that's sorted for 6th form. We can't do anything for universities because they sort of have a legal requirement. They only make adjustments under the Equality Act, but this has sort of sorted you out for now. So basically, I've reached out to the doctors multiple times to basically say, because my main worry was, also I knew I wanted to apply to universities, top universities. I spoke to some of the universities and I said, well, basically my arm hurts and I'm unable to write. And they went, okay, great. So what? That's literally what one of the universities said to me. So what? We basically can't do anything unless you have something legal. So that was a bit of a concern. So ultimately, it was just keep hammering the doctors, saying basically, I want to go to university. I need to have this. And they basically didn't do anything for a year of me just keep asking. I mean, I had like 2 or 3 physio sessions. I was sort of doing the exercises they told me to do. And then after about 2 or 3 sessions, it was really strange. The first 2 sessions were really positive, and the third session I turned up and she was just like, well, we've looked at the scan results, because they'd done like a scan of my thumb, and basically we don't think there's anything more you can do really, and sort of just stopped physio at that point. I had to wear my thumb in like a cast for about a year, to basically try and support it, because basically the tendon in my thumb had bent inwards, which is why it hurt so much, because it literally curved into a spiral. So every time I was writing, it wasn't just hitting the nerve, but actually it was hitting the other nerve in my thumb, so it was sort of hitting against each other. And I was having to take painkillers quite a bit. My mobility at that point started to decrease as well, and I was sort of experiencing a weird range of sort of effects. I didn't know what it was, and ultimately I knew I wanted to apply to Cambridge or Oxford. I applied to Oxford. Oxford were actually very understanding. I said to them I didn't really have a diagnosis, but the doctors did write me a sick note to say that basically he may have hypermobility. and they accepted that because basically it was a diagnosis in progress, and they were hugely flexible. And then basically after I'd done the test, I pressed them again, and I was like, look, I want to be going to university. I kind of need this in place pretty soon. And then within a week, they got me an appointment to see a specialist. He did a bunch of tests, and he was like, "You've got this thing called fibromyalgia." And I was like, "Okay, cool. What on earth is that?" And it made a lot of sense in a way because there's a lot of things, not having restorative sleep, for instance, my variable mobility, the fact that basically my tendon in my thumb had recovered, but I still felt the pain. It all sort of made more sense after getting that diagnosis. So basically, it was just a lot of basically hassling people until I got sort of something, because I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know what.
Your journey and your subsequent achievements have obviously inspired a number of people. And before I ask you a bit more about that kind of process and what you've learned, what I find really interesting is that intersection between disability and kind of socioeconomic backgrounds. You know, lots of conditions like this are largely invisible, they're difficult to diagnose, and people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are less likely, as demonstrated by research, to have these conditions diagnosed because they can't afford private healthcare. And in one of the interviews that you done a few years ago, one of the universities told you to go down this route, and you said you can't afford £800 to go private. So now that you've done some campaigning work for disabilities and, you know, serving on the trust for charities like the Sutton board, Sutton Trust, sorry, do you have any general thoughts around that intersection?
Yes, I mean, ultimately, I think it's actually the two most overlooked sort of categories when we think about intersectionality, in the sense that I think that a lot of organizations, companies are looking at things like race, for instance, LGBTQ plus equality, but actually the two topics that, in my opinion, are most overlooked are disability and socioeconomic background. Disability, even though at least at University of Oxford, at least 15% of people have a disability, I do think that it is really not spoken about, particularly as well. I'm applying for a lot of graduate schemes currently, and you'll find lots of schemes targeted other sort of forms of background, but you find very few targeted at particularly disabled people, which I think is quite interesting. Even though actually it shouldn't be a numbers game, it shouldn't be a zero-sum game, but ultimately, you know, there are lots of disabled people, and they're not being catered for ultimately. And as well on socioeconomic background, I think is another category that, I mean, there's recently been a class ceiling documentary on the BBC, and KPMG have done a report on socioeconomic background, but actually KPMG are leading the way in this regard. There are very few companies who are looking at the socioeconomic pay gap, where they may be looking at the gender pay gap, for instance. So ultimately, I think that these are areas where there's starting to be more thought, but it is, compared to other parts of sort of campaigning on social equality, I think that these areas are slightly behind. And I think that actually, particularly on socioeconomic background, what I found is it's actually quite a contentious area. I mean, no, strangely enough, no one wants to argue with you on disability, but when you talk about socioeconomic background, it gets quite contested, particularly if you start using the language of class. I find a lot of people find that as quite alienating because for some reason, when you speak about it in those terms, or when you speak about sort of systematic barriers, people ultimately always see the flip side. And what I mean by that is ultimately if you speak about how, you know, I want to increase access to those from state comprehensive schools, then that alienates those from private school backgrounds because ultimately they feel uncomfortable that you feel like you're saying that they aren't welcome. And I found that campaigning in the Oxford Union, and I found that in a lot of spaces, that actually, particularly on social background, it gets quite contested. And ultimately, a lot of people as well go to definitional principles. If you start doing class, they start going, but what makes someone this particular background? It's an identity people are willing to contest ultimately.
I watched your debate on the meritocracy thing, and I was wondering, with kind of all of these experiences that you had arguing with people on kind of at different viewpoints and at different, you know, stages of their life and different socioeconomic background, is there like one or two misconceptions that people generally have about this issue?
I think the sort of first misconception I'd say is that people think that if everyone is treated equally, they must be therefore equal. I don't think that's actually true.
Like equality versus equity.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that a lot of people sort of feel that, well, no one's deliberately been discriminated against for their socioeconomic background. We're not deliberately doing these things, so therefore they don't want to focus on it, when actually it's quite important. So I think that's sort of the first misconception. Trying to think sort of other misconceptions in this area really on sort of meritocracy. I mean, obviously my views on meritocracy have sort of shifted as well a little bit. To be fair, it's a term that was made for critique. I'm actually writing an essay on this currently, hence me knowing more about it because I've been looking at 1940s education policy in quite some depth. And obviously, meritocracy was a term invented in the 1950s as a form of critique of this sort of elite of merit. And I think ultimately as well, the other sort of debate in this space is it, again, sort of going back to this equity versus equality point of ultimately is, for example, contextual admissions a full meritocracy? To me, it certainly is, but a lot of people don't see it as such. And also, though, a lot of people don't see sort of steps to level the playing field and to actually make it fair as being sort of within a meritocratic framework. And I think as well, what makes it so difficult is ultimately most people on sort of a meritocracy debate. I mean, that debate did it as well, and I was doing it as well. Is ultimately, do we exist in a meritocracy? Well, the politicians want to say we do. Most people don't feel like they're fully judged on their merit, and therefore you actually spend a lot of time debating about whether you live in a meritocracy in the first place, which actually makes it harder, I think, to get to grips with the issues at hand.
I think there's a lot of kind of viewpoints on, campaigning for these issues. And as you mentioned, your views will evolve. The kind of older you get, the more experience you get, and the more people you speak to. But I want to understand a bit more about kind of your personal experiences. So, I mean, I went through some family illnesses as well, and they were some of the most character shaping experiences of my life. And I was wondering, what was your support network like as you went through that process of trying to diagnose and, dealing with all that uncertainty and fear that comes with it?
Yes, I mean, ultimately, in terms of support network, my school were generally not supportive, to be honest. I didn't really talk about the impacts I was having too much. It was sort of just the weird thumb thing to most people. And some of my friends noticed that I was limping, for instance, but I didn't really speak about it. It was only really when I got to university, particularly my second year, that I actually was more open about my disability. So it was mainly sort of my family, particularly my mum, who was sort of at home, who was sort of a support on that, doing research on what on earth it could be. So there wasn't tons of support in place, basically, and the school was quite stretched as well. So I wasn't able to make really many adjustments at all, even when I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia.
So it sounds like your family were quite obviously quite crucial to help you kind of get through the tough times. If say your parents listen to this podcast, what would you tell them now, having been through so much and been through that experience? Is there a word of gratitude that you might want to share?
Yeah, ultimately, I'm very thankful for the support I've received because I know I wouldn't be able to mostly keep going otherwise. Because ultimately, it felt like a lot of doors were closing or not being able to progress properly. The system's deeply frustrating. So yeah, thankful for the support.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing. Something else I found interesting, and I think it goes back to your point about, us changing our opinion. In one of the other interviews, you mentioned how you try to avoid using the term disability because you recognize that it impacts people in much worse ways than me, which is you. And I want to make sure the term is being used appropriately. So, and then you elaborated by saying, when applying for internships and they ask if I have a disability, I'm not sure what to put. It seems like you're far more open at Oxford to talk about disability, and it seems like there's an involvement on that. And I was wondering, was there a trigger to why your stance on that has changed?
Yes, I mean, ultimately, I'd say actually in some respects well, a lot of things opening up and things going in person sort of forced me to be more open because obviously when things were online, ultimately if all the calls are online, then I don't actually need any adjustments whatsoever, really. Ultimately, I need to use a laptop where all the calls are online. The main other sort of support I need is things like ergonomic furniture, which I have at home. So actually, when all the schemes were online, I didn't really need support. Whereas I feel like now that things have gone in person, it's almost forced me to have to be more open because obviously if I am going to visit employers in person, I am going to need changes. So I think partly that has forced me to be more open. I think also just being more comfortable in the space and ultimately being aware of all the impacts that a disability has had on me has partly changed that. And ultimately, I suppose trying to set, I wouldn't say a good example for others, but ultimately, a lot of the work that I've been doing has been on disability policy or supporting disabled people, and ultimately, therefore, it's important for me to be open about my own experiences and sort of bringing them to the table and ultimately being open with people, because otherwise I've found people haven't fully understood sometimes where that policy's been coming from.
So in terms of like adjustments and kind of, obviously we live in a society where we need to interact with other people. And I think a lot of the times people really want to empathize and they really want to help, but people don't really know how to. In one of your other interviews, you mentioned sometimes that you feel there's too much of a burden placed on you to have to explain yourself and to ask for what you need. So for people listening, like, is there an advice that you would give, having now gone through that experience, to kind of best support people with disabilities?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I suppose there's no perfect way of doing it. I think everyone around individuals may feel quite awkward ultimately because they don't want to be seen as too sort of naggy, asking lots and lots of questions. But equally, they don't want to be in the position where they're sort of lecturing someone who actually has the condition and the lived experience. So I think it can be quite an awkward place to be in. So also, I suppose it's just negotiating that with your friends as best as you can. Ideally, if you know they have a condition, maybe doing a bit of your own reading on it so that you have some awareness of it. But at the same time, I suppose, both sides, there is a bit of give and take in the sense of, having understanding that different people want to be treated in different ways, and also acknowledging that and being open in that regard, and showing that also you want to help as best you can without sort of being condescending in that regard.
I know that you don't sleep much, from my friends at Oxford.
It's changed. The last month I've slept on average 10 to 12 hours a night.
That's incredible. But I read somewhere, and maybe you can fact check this, but sometimes you were clocking up as many as 70 hours a week as JCR president and working 20-hour days. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, I last term, for reasons I don't know fully why it ended up happening, but last term I actually ended up, not for the JCL specifically, but I did end up waking up at 9 a.m. on a Thursday morning, and then I got in bed at 4:30 p.m. on the Friday afternoon for 20 minutes, then got out of bed again, and then went to bed properly at 11 p.m. on the Friday night. So you can add up, that was 42 hours or something ludicrous I ended up doing in the end. So yeah, I mean, ultimately, particularly in the first term as JCL president, I was working a lot of hours because ultimately there were a lot of issues I was passionate about. Because as a JCL president, in my opinion, you sort of have two functions. You have a proactive and a reactive function. So you have a proactive function, which is obviously what have you been elected on? What is your platform? Obviously, what issues do you think need fixing that maybe other people aren't speaking about? So the policy making side of things. And then as a JCL president, you also have the reactive side of things, which obviously as student issues come in, you need to, be hands-on. Maybe that's meeting the student, meeting with college, liaising with relevant authorities, doing research. So ultimately, you have two functions to balance. And particularly in the first half of the JCL president term, I think it's really important to do a lot of the proactive side as well as the reactive side, because ultimately you're going to get stuck in bureaucracy, and also you're going to get fatigued yourself. So you need to move quickly at the start when you've got a fresh mandate for change to really implement what you want to do. So ultimately, balancing all those functions, particularly the college I was in, it was quite a sort of hierarchical JCR. So it meant that I was basically having to attend all the meetings at college, which there was a number of a week. And then there was all the initiatives that I was running as well, which meant that I was clocking up a lot of hours because I was doing also a lot of reform on sexual violence, which took a lot of time, of meeting with survivors, meeting with campaign groups, doing research to ultimately change processes for dealing with issues like that. So that's sort of where that figure came from in terms of, yeah, I mean, it was quite common, that I'd get up at 10 a.m. and finish 5, 6 a.m. I've seen the sunrise many times in the last year. One of my New Year's resolutions is to sleep more, because also I don't think it's healthy to do that in the long term. But also I wanted to give my all to the role and try and deliver as much change as possible, and that takes a lot of time.
I like that distinction between proactive and reactive. And certainly I found that in my experience on the standing committee of the Cambridge Union, leading the Cambridge Student Investment Fund, or being president for the Cambridge University Entrepreneurs Society. And what I find particularly interesting about the reactive side is people handle it in very different ways. Some people, respond to messages instantly and try get things out of the way. Other people will block out a time during the day to just focus on responding to their emails and their messages. What was kind of your preference to deal with the reactive side of things?
So I was an ultimate, I was mainly an ultimate responder. Basically, emails wise, I'd always check them every day, usually before I went to bed, to try and keep it as short as possible. And also because I generally actually work better late at night. And then basically throughout the day, I was contactable via social media. So it's sort of how I think somehow sort of got accumulated. Because obviously during the day from 9 to 5, I just saw it as my main role because of how much stuff I had to do was mainly just, to be honest, meeting with students or writing policy papers or sort of brainstorming on that area. So that's sort of how I responded to things. I was very much sort of hands-on, wanting to deal with issues as quickly as possible and feeling like people are listened to. But at the very least, I think the worst response time I had was like 36 hours. But on average, I have all the emails synced to my phone. So also I was always reading the headlines to see if they was important, and if there's important, they could get responses in 5 minutes, 6 minutes if needed.
Wow, that's awesome. Well done for taking on such significant leadership roles. And I understand how much it could drain you, especially amidst a Oxbridge term when you already have so much work. I don't want to get you too excited, but let's talk about DJing. How do you put together sets? I mean, I recognize it's a broad question, but just to give you a chance to take charge in an area that I'm perhaps not too familiar in. How do you
So I've always insisted that my sets are live, in the sense that ultimately I don't go in to any gig with this is the exact order I'm going to play the songs, because I think it's hugely important to react to your crowd. Ultimately, to me, the number one role of a DJ is actually to choose music people want to hear and reacting to the audience rather than it being about the mixing or anything like that. Of course, I care about how good it sounds, but actually the number one priority is choosing the right music rather than the technicalities of how to get between the songs. So in terms of sort of putting together a set, what I've done is basically I have a 600 song sort of list of all the songs that I generally refer to. That's like my source material. And every term I'll update it by listening to the charts. And then in terms of sort of what I do over the holidays, I sort of get the decks out for a few hours. I'll try different things, try and make some of my own stuff. But also I try and listen quite broadly during the vacations to try and make sure that each term that I'm going out, the sets sound as different as possible. So when it actually gets to the night, basically it's just about choosing an intro and seeing where you go. Really, for me, it's an experience as much as it is for the audience. Because obviously, I don't know what I'm gonna do. I know sort of how I want to end. I know how I want to start, and then in between is literally just responding to the crowd and obviously trying to build the energy up at points. At other points, trying to hold it and sort of calm things down a bit, doing a bit more of a sing along. So also trying to create variety. I'm always trying to create variety, new sounds. So basically, I have that playlist. I may over the holidays sort of try things out and go that order may generally work, but actually it's all done on the night in terms of how I want to sort of put things together.
For things that I do, such as like basketball or music, there's this kind of a clear way of knowing kind of whether you're progressing, improving, and what kind of standard you're at, because there are different divisions of teams. For DJing, is there a way to know whether you are improving or not, or is it just very much a crowd reaction and subjective kind of reviews?
Yes, I think ultimately, in terms of how I know I'm progressing, ultimately I sort of internal and external. So in terms of internally, I'll reflect on if I think my sets are getting better. Ultimately, I think they are. Particularly in the last 6 months, I spent a lot of time on my technique. So while I've just stressed so much about the song selection, actually I've been focusing on trying to improve my skills, particularly over the last few months. And I think that my sets have been sounding much, much better, and they're getting much more creative. So also I internally evaluate and I listen back to my sets as well, to make sure that I think that they're good and to see where I think I can improve for future. But equally, of course, I'm taking into account crowd feedback, not just on the night, but also I do a lot of sets in my college. So I will speak to friends in college and say, what did you think of that? And last term, a lot of people saying it's the best they'd ever heard. And also as well, I suppose the best measure, if you want to go objective, so to speak, is the fact that the number of bookings I'm getting is going up, not down, which obviously means I must be doing something right, because obviously people want me to go out and still do this. I've got a lot of gigs coming over the next few months, which I'm really looking forward to. obviously what I'm being asked to do as well is getting bigger. That's the thing. I started off at the start of my second year when things started opening up with COVID, and I was literally just doing sets at college bops. Whereas now I'm sort of headlining, well, not exactly headlining, I think that's a bit of a stretch, but I'm performing at balls. I did headline, Balliol's garden party as well, and I've got a lot more balls to do this term. So ultimately, I think, to me at least, that indicates I'm obviously seen as the caliber of a ball act. I remember the first ball I was asked to do, I actually said no, which was literally the start of my second year. They was like, "Oh, we're looking for DJs. Like, do you want to do this ball?" And I was like, I literally remember writing back. I was like, "Sorry, I don't know. That's quite my thing, really. I'm more sort of like a party, wedding, birthday sort of DJ. I don't know. I quite have the skills to sort of do a ball set, which I think needs to be quite slick." And then within 6 months, I did like a small ball. And then by the end of the year, I'd done silent disco set for 2 hours at LMH ball, which was one of the bigger balls of the year, which got really, really solid reviews. And obviously now I think I'm doing about 3 or 4 balls this term. So it's quite interesting really looking back at that. And I was like, no, I don't think I'm going to do balls. And I was like, I'm not sure I'm quite got the skills for that. And obviously, in my opinion, it has been actually through hard work in terms of improving my skill set that I feel that I can deliver something of value to them. And obviously, people agree.
If I want to start DJing, how do I even get started, or how did you get started?
Yeah, so I sort of started in a weird way. So I used to work in the live events industry doing lighting, and when I was basically one of the venues we did training in, was looking for a DJ, and my boss at the time literally just suggested me. I was 15. He was like, "Oh, he might be good at it." So I sort of did it. I did a birthday party. Went okay. I was asked to do a wedding next month, which was quite a big step up. And so I did that. And then they started booking me. I did it regularly. I then was asked by my boss, because we were working in schools, if I'd be happy to do school discos. I did that and bought some of my own sort of sound and lighting equipment. And then I started going to birthdays and weddings, and actually had a big wedding season that was planned for the summer 2020, which got ruined. And at that point, I was like, okay, what can we want to do? So I did some sort of online stuff, um, exploring some different genres that didn't have the opportunity to play live. Um, then I did a set online for the Sutton Trust for their award ceremony, which was quite a unique experience. And I did an online ball as well, in Oxford, and I was like, okay, not really sure where this is going. And then basically started doing the sets, the bop sets, and then the booking started coming in for other places. I was like, okay, cool. It's not just here then. They want me to do it everywhere. And I literally have had weeks I've done 4 or 5 sets in a week. So in terms of getting started, I'd say ultimately for me, literally in Oxford, it was doing college bops is where I got started. But in terms of at home, it was just finding an opportunity, and taking it really. And in terms of sort of the skills, I mean, for the first few years, I couldn't really mix. I was, just a nice, smooth, basically I was like a jukebox, who was sort of generally good at reading the room at what music they wanted. And as I say, I'd always go back to music selection first is the most important thing to start at. It's ultimately about thinking, what do people want here? And I think particularly at universities, it's actually, in my opinion at least, slightly easier than other places. Because if you go to like a wedding, you've got 5-year-olds, 9-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 50-year-olds, 70-year-olds, right? You've got the whole spread. And trying to provide music that all of them enjoy can be quite challenging at points, because ultimately they will have grown up at different points. And they say usually the music that people like most is the music that they listened to as a teenager. Whereas when you're doing sort of bop sets, in my opinion, is actually slightly easier in that regard, because ultimately, A, I'm actually part of that generation, but also B, college ents provide you with suggestions, and also mainly just the fact that it's the same age group. So ultimately, what usually works with one audience will work with another audience, which is why I can make sort of a 600 song list of this is the material I'm going to refer to, and then sort of just make different sets from that, because ultimately, people, when I perform, they don't want me to play the most exotic, interesting sounds that there are. They're not expecting me to sort of turn up and make something entirely unique. They want to hear what they enjoy, maybe in a slightly different format. So start with that. And then in terms of the skills side, obviously I learned most of it on YouTube and then just practicing myself. Some of the softwares, in my opinion, are really, really intuitive. So you just find a software that you really click with. Obviously, you're going to work better that way, and just practice. And also, you'll get better in that regard. Because I certainly feel like I watched a few YouTube videos, and within a year, I'm beat matching, key matching, able to make mashups on the fly, using acapellas, sort of experimenting with all these different things, using loops to get between different songs, creating, in my opinion, quite unique sets. I've even had sort of professionals in the industry go, wow, I've never heard a set like that before.
fascinating how you have kind of built your skills such as through YouTube. And I remember actually reading an article of you advocating for like online courses and online learning and self-directed study. So I guess on that point, in terms of DJ or perhaps something else, how else have you kind of shown personal initiative to build skills, and how have that been a worthwhile investment throughout your childhood?
Yes, in terms of sort of building skills, trying to think to be honest. I mean, I've done a lot of courses, online courses. That's partly what I did during the COVID pandemic. Obviously, I was keen to learn and explore industries I didn't have the opportunity to. I did a lot of courses on digital skills like AI and marketing. So equally, how to manage teams effectively and conflict resolution, and exploring parts of history as well. I didn't have the opportunity to do during school. So I took the COVID pandemic really as an opportunity to learn broadly, try out subjects I hadn't learned before. I tried some philosophy, decided I disliked it, was very glad I hadn't applied for PPE, to doing a little bit of economics, to doing business, to doing a whole range of things really. And it was great to sort of have that exploration really, that time to explore without pressure. So yeah, I suppose I'm keen to learn. I used to work in the live events industry as well, as I say, and I used to actually tutor in lighting design. And a lot of that, again, I was learning that through reading instruction manuals, looking on YouTube. So I've sort of done a whole range of sort of weird and wacky things, really, where I've basically just used the internet to get along, really, and at the same time experimented. A lot of it has been experimentation as well, trying things out and seeing what to do next.
I study education at Cambridge, and I really do kind of see the merits in the phrase kind of like the best investment that you can make is in education and in yourself. And for you, quite literally, this DJing kind of investment that you have made has now turned into a business, Party with Dan. Firstly, why should I consider hiring Party with Dan? And secondly, where do you see this business going?
Yeah, so obviously why hire me? Well, ultimately, a lot of people have given good reviews, so don't just take my word for it. Take it for other people. But ultimately, I've got a passion about music, and I'm listening to music literally all day, every day, and every set I want to do, I want to make it the best I physically can. So in that regard, I think that obviously bring a lot of passion to the table. Ultimately, I grew up listening to music from the 70s, the 80s, and now I'm also doing a lot of modern music as well, and can equally do house. So I'm quite versatile in that regard. Um, and as I say, I've had that wide range of experiences from having done 50th birthday parties, wedding anniversaries, to literally doing, as I say, sort of these sets for balls. So that's sort of why I'd say hiring me is sort of a good choice. And ultimately, in terms of for those in Oxford looking for their balls, please do reach out. More than happy to, because I super enjoy doing them as well. Because ultimately it's great fun to have a crowd who just want to hear the music they really, really enjoy. In terms of where I see it going, I'm not sure, to be honest. I don't really have sort of a long-term plan. I do it because I enjoy it. So it's not sort of like there's a number crunching business model of I must get this number of gigs a year or whatever. There's no real thought on that. Also, I just do it because it's a hobby that I enjoy, and I'm happy that I get to share that with so many people. I didn't know what was going to happen, to be honest, post A levels, if I was going to keep doing it, and I'm glad I've got the opportunity to do it at university. So we'll see what happens. I still have my own kit because I used to do all the lighting and sound as well for my sets. So I could be able to sort of relaunch the wedding and birthdays to the side of things, doing school proms, because I was going to start doing school proms as well before the COVID pandemic hit. Or equally, may just do some stuff online. It may fizzle away. Who knows? Because I used to say do live events, lighting design for them, and I stopped doing that really before the pandemic. I did one or two sort of events post pandemic, but I've mainly moved more into events management now rather than actually doing the technical side myself. So sort of my interests are quite fast moving, as you can mostly see. I get involved with a lot of stuff, and some of it stays and some of it doesn't.
That's awesome. I mean, there are definitely people who have continued DJing and have very, very demanding careers. I can think of like David Solomon, CEO for Goldman Sachs, DJ D Sol.
Yep.
DJ D Dipper also has a good ring to it. But if I'm not mistaken, when you were in your teenage years, you had a chance to work with Sean Locke and John Richardson.
Yep.
In what context and what did you learn from them?
Yeah, so that was the lighting design. So basically, I started doing lighting design from the age of 13, but I was involved with the industry from the age of 11 through my school. And I got the opportunity for a year to work for my local theatre. and that involved doing the lighting for the acts that were coming through, and that involved Sean Locke, John Richardson. I also helped with Blood Brothers, Milkshake Live. I think Ronnie O'Sullivan I helped set the lighting up for. Des O'Connor, Jimmy Talbot. There's a whole range of shows that I worked on, which was really, really great experience. In terms of what I learned from them, I suppose sort of an interesting thing to say is that the people you see on stage are always the people you see behind the stage. John Richardson was literally exactly as you most probably can imagine him. Sean Locke was slightly not, to be honest. He was quite unhappy on the day that he was doing the set. He wasn't very well, and he was quite demanding in terms of what he needed from me. So I suppose it sort of shows that the personas that celebrities sort of make on television don't always compute into reality, or ultimately, part of their act is a performance in itself. It's not just them telling jokes. Actually, it's sort of the more theatre of how they sort of tell those jokes. So I suppose what did I learn from them? Obviously, being adaptable. Things went wrong. Not all of the lights were pointed in the right way. Also, negotiating with them, saying to them what you can and can't do. And I suppose more generally, just sort of working under pressure and sort of working on real opportunities. I suppose the first sort of, because Sean Locke was one of the first ones I did where it was sort of like I wouldn't say got you moment exactly. It was like, wow, okay, gosh, the man who's on stage is the guy who I've seen on television. It was sort of quite surreal, and there was sort of an element to that. Whereas now that's not entirely gone, but I've interviewed James Gorman, who's the CEO of Morgan Stanley. And I got AJ Tracy to come to the Oxford Union. There's all these other people who I've had the opportunity to interact with. I have Big Nasty's manager's number on my phone, and that's sort of normal to me now in a way. I literally have Dick and Dom on WhatsApp when I booked them for a ball that I got them to do last year. And I suppose I've sort of got used to. I still know it's surreal and it's quite crazy, but at the same time, sort of got used to that now. Sort of working with those big names and not being intimidated by that, and also still trying to do my best.
I'm mindful of the perceptions of like Oxford Union or Cambridge Union, and hence I have tried to kind of leave this maybe topic until now when people have got more of a context of you and that you don't get defined by that society. But do you mind if I ask you a couple questions about your experiences in the Oxford Union?
Yeah, go for it.
So you ran for president, Team Imagine. I also ran for president on an equalities-based manifesto, so there was some kind of similarity there. What would you say is the reputation of the Oxford Union within Oxford, firstly?
Yeah, so I think the reputation in Oxford, to be honest, is not hugely strong. I think that it has recovered to an extent this year because I think that we had a good way of events. I think during the pandemic, it became quite difficult actually to get speakers to give events, because ultimately I think part of the attraction of a place like that is the unique setting. Obviously, a lot of them want to come to the chamber, give their address, they want to see it on YouTube, be able to share it with their followers, and because it was online, they weren't able to do that so much. So I think that the pandemic discouraged people from getting involved because there was a bit of Zoom fatigue there. But I think the reputation is quite mixed because ultimately, every time there's an election, people, and I'm not blameless for, I send the messages as well, but every time there's an election, they get people who they may not know fully well sending them lots of messages asking them to go out and vote, give up their time for a campaign that they most probably don't know that much about, and all they enjoy is the fact that Big Nasty came a few terms ago or whatever. I think some people really dislike that element of it, and ultimately, these societies, given it's a free speech society, it has quite a poor reputation in some circles because ultimately it hosts speakers who people don't feel appropriate to be given a platform, and there's a whole debate about whether, how they should be challenged if you are hosting speakers that are controversial, and ultimately if it's appropriate for the society to host those speakers in the first place, in the sense of what they say can be a challenge to people's rights, their dignity. So I think it's got, to be honest, a quite mixed reputation. We'll see how that changes. It's in its bicentenary year. Currently, there's new people coming through every term because the committee changes every term. So it means that the character of the society can change quite quickly, but ultimately, like any student organisation, it does face its scandals as well. And I think that it actually has a stronger reputation outside of Oxford than a reputation inside of Oxford. So yeah, very mixed, very mixed.
So One of my proudest achievement in the union was producing a kind of a how to get involved guide where every kind of position was demystified. So I think I interviewed like 40 former committee members and kind of drafted it all up. So I was wondering, it's quite interesting because obviously I don't know much about the Oxford Union. So if I was a fresher or if I was to do a degree at Oxford now and say, I really want to do well, get on the committee for the Oxford Union, what would you recommend me to do?
I mean, ultimately, the first thing is make sure you want to get involved. I think a lot of people sort of rush into it, and it is worth taking that time to reflect because it is, in my opinion, it can be deeply, deeply demanding. When I was serving as vice president, I was taking phone calls at all hours of the day, and there were days where I was barely sleeping at all, full stop. So ultimately, you've got to make sure that's a commitment you want to take on.
Can relate.
But equally, it can be very rewarding. I don't want to undermine its positives either. It can be a very, very rewarding experience in the sense of also getting to interact with all these high profile people, having phone calls from Morgan Stanley and whatever at 10 o'clock in the morning is quite an interesting experience. And also it sort of gets you prepared for the real world. And also you get to host some really interesting conversations. Also, yeah, make sure first thing is you do want to get involved. And ultimately, I got involved not because of the politics. I got involved because I wanted to make it better. I actually served as disabilities officer for 2 terms before I became a president sponsorship officer, and then I ran for election. So ultimately, don't rush these things. Go for a position that you want to go in, that you're passionate about. You don't have to join if you're interested in the politics, but be aware it is a political society. And ultimately, despite whatever you try to do, unfortunately, you will get dragged into the dramas on these things. And I think you have to be quite prepared for that, which can be quite intimidating or challenging. So yeah, I mean, also if you want to get involved, there are handbooks available online, which you can have a look at, which gives some information. Also, you come along. There are, the meetings are all public, so you can come along to the meetings, see what they're sort of talking about, working about. But ultimately, it's very demanding. It can be very rewarding, and also you've got to make that trade off and sort of weigh that up and see if that's something you want to get involved in.
So you have confirmed 29 speakers, including AJ Tracy and Big Nasty. You've worked more than 110 vacation days and also played a pretty major role in the union's Equality and Diversity Review for 2022. You've also passed 3 rule changes, including the abolition of library fines and introducing specialist support assistance for disabled members of committee. How did you, what was driving kind of your passion to go above and beyond for these? I'm mindful of your upbringing, in Petersburg, neither of your parents went to university, state comprehensive school, etc. But surely it takes something extraordinary that reminds you at 3 a.m. in the morning to continue powering through the bureaucracy, the challenges, the politics, the lack of appreciation. Why?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, and one I asked myself at various points as well, particularly over the summer, when I sort of didn't have a team together, and I was sort of reviewing why I was involved and also what I wanted to do with my time. Very conscious of the fact that I didn't know if I would get an extra 2 terms to continue that work. I mean, ultimately, I remember why I joined the society in the first place, which was I was on the Unique program. I attended the Oxford Union. I heard a talk about Malcolm X and what he said in the chamber, and also I saw it as a place that could host important discussions, and it could have an impact. And obviously, one of the ambassadors there said, "Well, actually, you could really make a difference here. It's something you might be interested in. You should give it a thought." And obviously, it's why I joined was basically that interaction I had on the Unique Access program. And initially, in the first term, I just went to lots of speaker events. I really enjoyed those speaker events. Also, we had a great array of events, and there was one of the few societies who really kept functioning as best as they could during the coronavirus pandemic, because not all societies were able to fully migrate online. So I was quite appreciative of that. But also, I joined the society, as I say, to make it better, particularly for disabled members. That was what I was doing on the Access Committee for the first 2 terms. And I kept that up throughout my whole time on the committee. I went to Access Committee every term that I was on the committee, so for 2 years. And I always wanted platform access, trying to collaborate with university if we can to increase outreach and actually use our resources for social good and to try and inspire other people to improve their debating skills. Ultimately, for me, it was about that broader social impact that we could have, but equally wanting to deliver the best events physically possible for the members. Ultimately, we want the big names, so I was working as hard as I physically could to get them. And in terms of some of the rules changes, ultimately it was about the barriers that I faced in the society that I wanted to change, and how there weren't specialist support assistance for those with disabilities, for instance. Also thinking how we can make it more accessible for those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. obviously it was always thinking about what the barriers, and I was always taking on board feedback from friends, from critics, from the team who I had working with me, and also from those on committee. Ultimately, I was very open. They were coming to me with ideas, and also I was just trying to work as hard as I could to implement them. So yeah, it was always about just trying to do the best that I physically could, and ultimately the work was challenging, but at points, as I say, I found it very rewarding as well.
I understand that, succeeding in a political environment like that, you kind of have to rely on friends, and that kind of intensity also helps to form friendships. You made a very touching post for Rosalie, Lucas, Kiaran, and Nadia a month ago. I guess the final question in relation to the union is, are there any other shout outs that you particularly want to give when you reflect upon your time on the union and how those people have impacted you?
Yeah, so the people you named there, they were my officers. So I was running for president. Rosalie was running for librarian, which is the role that I held, which was in charge of the speaker events. Lucas was running for treasurer, and Kieran was running for secretary. And then Nadia was running for the governing body, the standing committee, but also she was basically the campaign guru in the sense of, every hour that I was awake, she was awake, if not more. She was doing all of our social media graphics. She was basically doing whatever Rosalie and I needed as well to support us both as candidates. And without all those people, we wouldn't have done as well as we did. Of course, we didn't win, but we still did very, very well. We didn't have very long to get together the campaign. In terms of other people, I mean, there's so many people. Cameron, who was a Sutton Trust alum, was actually why I got involved in the union. So basically, the way I got involved on the committee was someone who'd actually been on the Sutton Trust program, saw that I'd also been on the Sutton Trust program, and they reached out to me and said, actually, I want to get more people like you into the union. So I know that union coffees have a very negative reputation, but actually that was a very positive conversation for me. And actually it was nice as well that someone from a similar background to my own was reaching out and saying, actually, I think you could have a really good impact. And despite the fact he's running for election, he was not actually encouraging me to run for election at all. He's like, I think you'd have the most impact as disabilities officer because you could work on policy in that area. So I think, Cameron was sort of the spark that got me onto the committee. I was lucky to work with some great presidents like Adam and Shenkai, and Molly and Michael, and then Ahmad was the president who I supported to run with. I was lucky for their support in various ways and the mentoring that they provide as well. Anvi as well was hugely important during the campaign in keeping us all sane. Danielle, who worked on the campaign, Nidhi, who worked on the campaign, Conrad, who ran for standing with us, who put our trust in us and really sort of got it all going and got a lot of people on board. There's so many people I could name who were so helpful in many, many ways throughout my journey. Maddie's one of my best friends who I met on union committee. So there's many, many people who I could thank, which could go on for a very, very long time. But also, I think you're right. Not everyone you work with is your friend, and of course, it is a political environment. But actually, as you say, some of my closest friends have come from the union, and I'm still in touch with them. And there may still be the occasional bit of political gossip, but we do many talk about other sane, normal things.
Well, I'm sure that the union was a very transformative experience that you will appreciate more and more as you get older. And I having served on the standing committee for the Cambridge Union, I can also appreciate the hard work that you have put in. And, not everyone would kind of appreciate just how much you would have cared about it when you were in there. So I've got a couple concluding questions for the interview, but given that this is my goal is to give you a legacy worthy interview, meaning that a piece of recording that you can look back on in 10, 20 years time, are there any other thing that you would like to be featured in this recording before I go on with my final two?
Wow, that's actually the most challenging question of the interview. Very tricky, really.
We have covered a lot.
I'm going to say we've covered a lot. I've done a lot of things, obviously, as well. I know it sounds very crazy, but I struggle to remember all the things I'm involved with as well, right? Because right now, I'm working on this Imposter Syndrome Project. I'm the Ents and Music Chair for the upcoming 93% Club Ball. I'm still doing all the DJing, still serving on the boards that I mentioned, and I'm looking for other opportunities to get involved as well. So yeah, I suppose. 2022 particularly as well, I would say was a crazy year, one I don't know I could live again in the sense of how demanding it was and how tiring it's been, but equally a hugely enjoyable, rewarding experience. I suppose really, I know that you said it's not about the listeners, but I do sort of want to address them very briefly. in terms of, because I think some of the questions that people ask me quite a bit is, how do you do it? Would you recommend, following the path I did? Because I did the JCR and the union together, which are seen as traditionally polar opposites. The people who are usually involved in these things are as far apart as you can physically be. I'd say that first thing is it didn't come without sacrifice, in the sense of, I was hugely busy, not resting at points. It was very demanding and mentally taxing. I wasn't able to see my friends as much as maybe I wanted to at various points, or there were some days where I would have loved to just close my laptop and got in bed for 15 hours, but I just couldn't. So in terms of would I recommend it to others, I'd say that's also up to you if you want to make those sacrifices. But I think that what I found really beneficial in a way is obviously they're very different environments. And I found the JCL was a good place to make meaningful impact and meaningful change. And obviously that's what I wanted to deliver in the union. So it's good to work in a space where that was fully respected. The JCR is not really so much of a political space. So it was refreshing to be able to just focus on goals. Whereas with the union, you've always got to think about things through multiple lenses. And also at the same time, I think through the union, I learned how to get things done, in the sense of being effective, maneuvering through bureaucracy. And obviously there was a sort of a cross-fertilization in that regard. And also as well, proposals that I thought of success in the JCR, I tried to bring to the union and vice versa. So I think they were quite self-reinforcing. Obviously, I learned a lot from both experiences. And actually, I think it kept me quite grounded, and it stopped me from getting too sucked into bubbles on either side, because ultimately I always had the other job to do, if that made sense. I always had obligations to both sets of people who'd elected me, which meant that I was always juggling those. And it stops you sort of getting too trapped in, I'm just going to focus on this. So yeah, would I do it again? Not sure. I am very, very tired, but I certainly have found it very enjoyable and rewarding, and I learned a lot from the experience.
Thank you very much for sharing and for anticipating some of the questions I wanted to ask. But rest assured, I've got a new question for you to end. The second to last one, or perhaps third to last one, depending on what you say. But what were kind of the report card comments that you were getting in primary school? Were there like common themes? And, when you look back, what was the trajectory of that kid?
I mean, I can't remember them that much. I remember I always used to enjoy refereeing the football. And yeah, I can't remember otherwise. I think I was, by year 3 or 4, I was just sort of known as the kid who worked hard on sort of academics, where I think that there was always an element of underestimation to an extent. I've always sort of surpassed people's expectations. So yeah, not sure exactly because I can't remember what they said, but that's what I remember.
Second to last question. What is a question that you wish more people would ask you?
Question that you wish more people would ask you. I don't know. I think I enjoy the questions that, because everyone, no offense to the start of the interview, everyone asks about the happy birthday stuff. And it's sort of a nice sort of story. But I sort of enjoy the questions that are a bit more thought provoking in terms of not just sort of giving advice to other people, but like what was the most transformative experience you've had, or I don't know. It's sort of, I enjoy questions that are, I found like sort of some sort of job interview, but questions that feel like they're addressed just to you, that maybe other people aren't asking. So ultimately, I have to say I do hate the question, "What do you plan to do in the future?" because I don't have a clue. So that question is not one. I mean, you can ask it; everyone asks it, but I don't know, to be honest. I think I give a different answer every time I asked it. But a question I think that people should ask. I suppose, to be fair, I think quite an interesting question is ultimately what did you want to do when you was like 14 or 15? Because it's changed so radically. And I think it shows ultimately how my ambitions have increased in the sense of thinking that I, should do something in terms of doing a degree that was academic. That was not my plan then. And also I think it's quite interesting as well, talking about working in the live events industry, doing all the shows, that sort of stuff. Because I think it's quite a different experience. And like I worked for a circus during my GCSEs, which people around me still find crazy and hilarious. I think them sort of ones are, I don't know, it in some respects, it also helps people understand why I'm, still organising all the big events, why I do so many different things, because obviously I was doing them then. It's not just I've come to Oxford and sort of exploded. I was already doing all of these sort of different activities and had all these different interests.
Thank you. Final question, a really hopefully challenging one is, what is like a fact or a theory or a truth that you deeply believe in, but perhaps many other people don't? Like, how are you contrarian?
A fact I believe in that many people don't. Um, I mean, the one that I'm writing and talking about a lot currently is that class still exists in the UK, and that ultimately, despite all of my achievements and everything I've done, I still face a lot of barriers and I'm still judged differently because of having a different disability, because of the school I went to, because of the social background I come from, even just the way I construct sentences, not the way I speak. I have quite a neutral accent, but even just, what I talk about, how I work in spaces. My friends sort of commented on it who've come from sort of similar backgrounds to my own, that I didn't really change how I was when I entered these spaces that may be dominated by those from different backgrounds. And ultimately, it's interesting to see how people can find that challenging. Also, you don't fully click with that. So yeah, I think also class or structural barriers still exist in UK society, and also they need to be spoken about more.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Stan. I can say that from Cambridge, looking at your kind of achievements and involvements at the other place, it's been great to see someone care so much about their community and to take on a bunch of responsibility and clearly remembering their roots and remembering all the people who supported them. And I would like to thank you for the time of this interview, but also for the wider work that you do for your community. And I hope you find great fulfillment, whether or not you get recognized publicly or not. And very much wish you a very happy 2023. And when you come to Cambridge, coffee's on me, of course.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's been great to speak to you. Although I was sort of chuckling away when you said you are fulfilled, because that was the name of the slate that won the election against me. So yes, that word now will have connotations forever for me.
I'm so sorry, but yeah, no pun intended. See you then.